What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my favorite boss fights. As someone who plays and reviews a lot of games, it kind of goes without saying that I have fought many a boss. And believe it or not, I find most of them pretty unremarkable. They're just kind of there. However, occasionally, bosses for one reason or another will catch my interest and be particularly memorable, which is rarely because they are difficult or anything like that. In fact, personally, especially as someone who plays a lot of RPGs, I think what makes a good boss isn't how challenging it is per se, but rather is it a satisfying conclusion to the gameplay at the time. Because while a challenge is certainly welcome, nothing really lets a game down, especially an RPG, like a boss fight that doesn't feel like the culmination of everything that led up to that point. Though even beyond that, sometimes a boss is just cool, and that is certainly reason enough as well. But those are things to keep in mind as we move through this list, and with all of that said, let's actually dive into it a little bit. First up, we have the Lamenting Abomination from Divinity Original Sin 2, an optional boss from Act 2 that might come across as a bit of a mystery if you've ever ran into him, because there's very little in the way of explanation about what this thing is or why it is here, which forms the crux of why I like this boss so much. Outside of the fact that this thing looks incredibly cool, it also has an air of mystery as a result. We can find this thing on the far left side of the map, seemingly praying at an altar, and if you get close enough it will attack you. It has a somewhat unique gimmick to the fight where it will summon adds that will apply a buff that gives it increasing damage, so you need to deal with it relatively quickly. But that, combined with the interesting conversation you can have with the abomination before it attacks you, where it discusses being in a great deal of pain, while also seeming to answer to some sort of entity from the altar before attacking you. But as I mentioned, nothing is ever really explained about this guy, but there are a few theories. Because it's Divinity Original Sin 2 and the entity speaking to it, you might be inclined to think that it is the God King directing whatever this abomination is, but there is a decent amount of evidence that points to it probably having a connection to Duna, which is the god of the dwarves. While it's not directly in-game, the lore book that accompanied the game actually references a short story about a dwarf who has a nightmare about this creature, and the creature itself is an amalgamation of wolves, which are venerated by dwarven culture in the Divinity series, and the altar at which it is praying is technically an altar to the Seven, not the God King. But even in spite of that, it's a weird mystery that will never get fully solved, which makes the Lamenting Abomination very memorable, and I would actually say my favorite boss fight in Divinity Original Sin 2 across the board. Shifting gears a little bit though, we have the Ancestor Spirit from Elden Ring. Technically there are 2 of these, one being a stronger variant that I think is called the Royal Ancestor Spirit, but it is these sort of stag-like spirits that we can find in Elden Ring that constitute a boss fight. And given that Elden Ring is a game with a large variety of boss fights, many of which are very challenging, it might come as a surprise that Ancestor Spirit is the one I like the most, as it is probably one of the more unremarkable fights in the game. Because truth be told, they're pretty low health enemies, have a relatively standard moveset that's easy to follow, which makes them, as far as Elden Ring goes, pretty easy boss fights. But the reason I like them so much is rather the general aesthetic of the fight. The music in these arenas is very sort of melancholy, as well as the way the Ancestor Spirit actually approaches you is much more, I would say, graceful than a lot of other enemies, and everything from the way this monster moves on top of the music in the background and the arena itself always kind of evokes this feeling of sadness in me that makes me feel like I might be the bad guy for killing this thing. But yeah, overall, I just really enjoy the way this particular boss moves, as well as the overall vibe of the arena you're fighting in. It's just a very unique boss fight because of those things to me, which is why it's one of my favorites from that game. That said though, moving right along to number 3, with a bit of a shift in tone, we have Frank Horrigan from Fallout 2, who serves as the final boss of that game. I like Frank Horrigan because he is simultaneously both a monster of a boss fight as well as a very interesting character. He is a soldier working for the Enclave, doing a lot of their dirty work, but interestingly enough, technically speaking, he is a super mutant, but even that label doesn't exactly fit because after being exposed to the FEV, he was then further experimented on by the Enclave themselves over the course of years, which all of that collectively has turned him into a sort of one-of-a-kind mutant that resulted in this absolute monster of a man that we have to fight to wrap up Fallout 2. And all of that is justification for why his stats are through the roof. He has the maximum amount of HP, he has resistances that are ridiculous, his stats are also maxed, and if you're trying to fight this guy head on, you're in for a bad time. Luckily, there's some ways around this. You can convince some people to help you in the fight, as well as hack the turrets around the arena to target him, and if you can do both of those things, if you have a character that's set up to do that, it's actually a pretty easy fight. But either way, throughout the game and then in this fight, he's just an incredibly intimidating figure that certainly makes for a memorable conclusion to this title. But what I actually like the most about this fight is the unique death animation he has, where even when you kill him and he gets torn in half, he still somehow isn't quite done with you yet, which makes for a fight that's hard to forget. But speaking of hard to forget, in fourth place we have Jon Irenicus from Baldur's Gate 2. Again, the final boss from that game as well, or at least for the base game that is, and Irenicus, in my opinion, is the epitome of a boss fight being a satisfying narrative conclusion as opposed to being an amazing boss fight, because as far as the fight goes, the initial phase of it is pretty much a standard fight against a mage. You'll want to strip away his magic protections, at which point he's really not that intimidating, but he has some 9th level spells that if he manages to cast will really mess you up, such as Time Stop or Power Word Kill. But after you defeat his first phase, you ultimately get dragged into hell and then have to complete a series of challenges before fighting him yet again, and this is all after he spent most of the entire game just kind of winning, actually, with you only getting to him at the very end of the game in what feels like almost dumb luck at times. But what I love about this fight, again, isn't so much the fight itself, but rather what it does for the narrative and how much effort they put into making this a satisfying conclusion to the story of Baldur's Gate 2, which I think is one of many reasons that Jon Irenicus is considered one of the greatest villains in gaming. Truly a memorable fight. But that does bring us to our final entry on the list, and this one is the Voices of Nerat from Tyranny, which is a very creepy boss, and is technically the spirits of many people combined into one sort of amalgamation of a person known as the Voices. Depending on how you play through Tyranny, which is an isometric CRPG, you may or may not even fight this guy, but if you do, he is one of the Archons, which in the world of Tyranny is an almost demigod-like figure who has remarkable amounts of control over some unique magical aspect. In the case of the Voices of Nerat, that is secrets. And due to the nature of that, it's a little difficult to pin down much in the way of specific details about him, but essentially, the Voices of Nerat is able to absorb memories from people by sort of consuming them, adding their voice to the chorus, as they would say, hence why they're called the Voices. But I always really enjoyed the boss fight against this guy simply because Nerat is so incredibly creepy. Everything about this character is really off-putting, and finally being able to kill them is incredibly satisfying in a game like Tyranny. Though the boss fight itself is not without its challenge, the Voices will summon in other spirits that they've presumably consumed at some point to fight alongside them, and this will be done sort of cyclically throughout the fight, so you'll have to continue to kill these things until you manage to kill Nerat, who's also going to be throwing high-level spells at you the entire time. Which means this particular fight sees us kind of having to manage a lot of individual elements to effectively fight it, but with the Voices being the Archon of Secrets, even upon their defeat, it still kind of feels like they knew something you did not, and the death of this character is directly related to one of your companions as well, which kind of ties into that theme. But ultimately, I love this boss fight because it's so satisfying to actually be able to fight this thing, but then even once that fight is over. You're kind of questioning whether or not that was the right thing to do, or if you didn't just play into its hands in some way. But overall, a very creepy, well done character, and a very well done boss fight. But that is going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. That has been 5 of my favorite boss fights, though there are certainly plenty more. I have done a video like this once previously, over a year ago for instance. But by all means, let me know down below any particularly memorable boss fights you really enjoy. I'd love to hear about them. Which of course means don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.